She once escaped poverty by staying silent. Years later, she tried to buy silence from two boys who refused to do the same. Alessandra Vance, a self-made black billionaire, believed she was offering protection when she tried to quietly compensate Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross. But when the footage leaked, the world didn't see generosity. They saw a pattern. And this time, survival strategy turned into instant karma. Dr. Alessandra Vance remained one of the most powerful figures in Atlanta's technology sector, even as controversy lingered around her name. Vance Technologies continued reporting strong quarterly earnings, and her foundation still commanded national recognition. Yet the public humiliation incident from weeks earlier had shifted perception. Commentators debated her leadership style. Sponsors maintained cautious distance. Investors watched carefully. Her dominance was intact, but it was no longer unquestioned. Across the city, Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross continued refining their transparency platform from a modest co-working space funded through community support. Their project mapped scholarship eligibility data and exposed algorithmic bias patterns in nonprofit institutions. Media attention followed them, but they declined emotional framing. They positioned themselves not as victims of a viral moment, but as architects of structural clarity. The shift unsettled those who expected outrage rather than strategy. A private meeting invitation arrived through an intermediary connected to Vance Enterprises. The location was deliberate, a glass-walled executive office on the 39th floor of a luxury high-rise overlooking downtown Atlanta. The skyline stretched wide beneath controlled lighting, reinforcing hierarchy before a word was spoken. Alessandra entered composed, dressed in a tailored ivory suit that projected authority softened by restraint. Her posture signaled resolution rather than confrontation. The proposal presented to the boys was structured and generous by conventional standards. It included expanded scholarship funding, guaranteed placements within prestigious internship programs, relocation grants to neighborhoods with stronger infrastructure, and direct seed investment into their transparency platform. Embedded within the documentation were non-disclosure clauses, narrative management provisions, and agreements limiting public commentary on internal foundation practices. The language emphasized partnership and forward momentum. The framing suggested opportunity, not silence. Alessandra positioned the package as strategic alignment. She conveyed that prolonged public friction would benefit no one, particularly not two young innovators at the beginning of their careers. The offer implied protection from reputational volatility and financial instability. It suggested elevation rather than containment. On the surface, it appeared philanthropic. Malachi studied the documents without visible reaction. His stillness reflected calculation, not hesitation. Jalen noted the subtle phrasing embedded within the clauses, recognizing that acceptance would require relinquishing autonomy over their platform's investigative scope. The transaction was polished, but its architecture was clear. Compensation was tied to containment. Support was conditional on narrative discipline. The emotional weight in the room did not arise from hostility. It emerged from contrast. Alessandra believed she was stabilizing disruption through structured generosity. The boys understood they were being offered insulation in exchange for silence. What appeared as mentorship carried the imprint of damage control. When the meeting concluded, no agreement was signed. Alessandra maintained composure, confident that strategic incentives often matured with time. Malachi and Jalen exited the building with measured restraint, aware that refusal carried risk but acceptance carried surrender. Above them, within the building's integrated security system, a discrete archival process continued automatically. Neither side noticed the silent indicator light within the executive conference panel. The system had recorded everything. The executive floor of Vance Enterprises was designed for privacy. Frosted glass walls, encrypted Wi-Fi channels, biometric access points. Discretion was part of the architecture. What Alessandra Vance did not regularly consider was that the building's integrated security system automatically archived all executive conference room activity for liability protection. The feature had been installed years earlier after a minor contractual dispute, then quietly absorbed into operational routine. No one thought about it unless something went wrong. 3 days after the private meeting, a junior IT technician named Carter Doyle noticed irregular server traffic during a routine storage audit. Large encrypted video files had been automatically categorized under executive session backups. One file exceeded typical duration parameters and was flagged by the system's anomaly detection software. Carter's responsibility was procedural, not investigative. Yet when he opened the file preview window to confirm metadata, a frozen still frame appeared. Dr. Alessandra Vance seated at the conference table, her hand extended mid-motion as she slid a document toward two young men across from her. The image alone carried weight. The timestamp aligned precisely with the day and hour Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross had been seen entering the building. Carter was not privy to the meeting's purpose, but the context circulating online made the frame impossible to ignore. The foundation controversy had not cooled. Public debate still simmered. Sponsors were cautious. Analysts were watchful. The idea that a private settlement discussion had occurred during peak scrutiny introduced a volatile variable. Carter understood corporate protocol required silent documentation. Instead, he copied the file reference code and extracted a blurred screenshot without audio. The action was impulsive but deliberate. Using an anonymous account, he sent the image to investigative journalist Rowan Mercer with a single encrypted note referencing executive backup archives. He did not send the full video. Not yet. Rowan had been monitoring Foundation activity closely. When the screenshot arrived, he immediately cross-checked the metadata embedded in the image header. The timestamp matched the publicly known meeting window. Geolocation markers confirmed the executive floor. The blurred image showed Alessandra's posture unmistakably formal, the boys seated across from her, the document between them like a physical pivot point. Within hours, the screenshot circulated cautiously through selective online forums before surfacing publicly. Speculation reignited with greater intensity than the original humiliation incident. The narrative shifted from leadership style to attempted payoff. Commentators debated whether the image represented mentorship funding or strategic silencing. The absence of audio magnified uncertainty. Vance Enterprises released no immediate statement. Silence this time amplified suspicion. Market analysts noted minor volatility returning to the stock. Advocacy groups called for clarification. The Foundation's transparency claims were questioned more aggressively than before. Rowan understood that a single image could ignite curiosity, but proof required context. Late that evening, an encrypted transfer notification appeared in his inbox. The sender identification was masked, but the file size indicated full audio-visual data. The subject line contained no explanation. Rowan hesitated briefly before initiating download, aware that whatever existed within that file could permanently alter the balance of power. The moment the blurred screenshot began circulating across national platforms, Vance Enterprises shifted into strategic containment. Alessandra's legal team assembled before sunrise in a glass-walled war room overlooking downtown Atlanta. Crisis advisors reviewed the image frame by frame, calibrating language that would minimize speculation without validating accusation. Within hours, an official statement described the private meeting as philanthropic assistance offered to support two promising young innovators. The wording was deliberate, emphasizing mentorship and opportunity rather than negotiation. Television networks replayed the screenshot repeatedly while analysts debated the ethical boundaries of influence. Commentators questioned whether wealth could remain benevolent when tied to narrative management clauses. Financial news outlets reframed the issue as reputational risk assessment. Sponsors who had previously adopted a wait-and-see posture now requested direct clarification calls. The controversy no longer revolved around tone, it revolved around power dynamics. Alessandra maintained public composure, projecting steadiness in scheduled appearances and internal communications. She did not acknowledge the screenshot directly. Instead, she reiterated her commitment to youth advancement and systemic reform. The strategy was familiar: contain uncertainty through controlled messaging. However, the absence of transparent detail created a vacuum that speculation quickly filled. In contrast, Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross refused invitations to deliver emotional responses. Their public update, posted through their platform's official channel, reaffirmed their dedication to algorithmic transparency and nonprofit accountability. They avoided personal accusation. They did not describe the meeting as bribery. They did not escalate rhetoric. Their restraint was intentional. By declining to dramatize the encounter, they shifted attention toward structural reform rather than interpersonal conflict. The emotional undercurrent became increasingly visible. Corporate messaging operated through polished press releases and legal vocabulary. The boys operated through data charts, policy suggestions, and community-centered proposals. The contrast was subtle but powerful. One side sought stabilization, the other sought recalibration. Community leaders from West Hollow began voicing open support for Malachi and Jalen. Pastors, educators, and local business owners issued statements praising the boys' composure and integrity. Their endorsements reframed the narrative from confrontation to courage. The grassroots backing introduced legitimacy that extended beyond social media reaction. Inside Vance Enterprises, tension mounted quietly. Executives tracked sponsor feedback in real time. Minor stock fluctuations signaled investor sensitivity. Alessandra's authority remained intact, but pressure accumulated beneath its surface. She understood that perception often preceded consequence. Late that evening, as debate panels reached peak viewership, Rowan Mercer completed his review of the encrypted file he had received. The footage was clear, uninterrupted, and unmistakable. It captured the entire meeting from beginning to end. There were no edits, no missing segments, no contextual ambiguity. Without preview announcement or promotional build-up, the full unedited video uploaded to a secure investigative platform and went live to the public. The full video required no commentary. Within minutes of its release, it began circulating across every major platform with the velocity of inevitability. Viewers no longer debated blurred screenshots or partial interpretations. They watched the entire exchange unfold in real time, the composed setting, the structured compensation package, the careful language framing silence as strategic alignment. The moment Alessandra referenced, managing narrative exposure, was clipped, isolated, and replayed repeatedly. The phrase crystallized public perception. What had once been described as philanthropic assistance now sounded unmistakably transactional. By sunrise, the clip trended nationally. News networks replaced speculation panels with direct footage analysis. Legal experts dissected non-disclosure clauses. Ethics professors debated the moral boundaries between mentorship and leverage. Social discourse shifted decisively. The question was no longer whether the meeting occurred, it was whether power had attempted to purchase quiet compliance. Financial markets responded with measurable caution. Vance Technologies' stock dipped sharply at opening bell before stabilizing slightly under heavy trading volume. Two prominent institutional investors announced temporary withdrawal pending independent review. Their statements were measured but unmistakable, signaling reputational instability rather than legal accusation. Sponsors followed with carefully worded suspensions. Alessandra's empire did not collapse overnight, but it trembled in ways it never had before. Inside corporate headquarters, emergency calls echoed through executive offices. Board members requested immediate internal briefings. Compliance officers reviewed documentation trails. Public relations consultants recalibrated messaging strategies, though each revision felt reactive rather than authoritative. Alessandra remained outwardly composed, yet the architecture of control she had cultivated for years appeared fragile beneath the surface. What unsettled observers most was the absence of dramatics from Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross. They did not celebrate the video's release. They did not frame the moment as victory. Instead, they reiterated their commitment to transparency, reform, and algorithmic accountability. Their restraint amplified the contrast between documentation and defense. The empire was not shaking because of outrage, it was shaking because of proof. The phrase instant karma trended briefly before being replaced by more analytical language, but the sentiment lingered. Public perception often hinges on symbolism, and the symbolism was unavoidable. A billionaire who once publicly disciplined two young men was now publicly scrutinized for attempting to contain them. The reversal felt cinematic, yet it unfolded through quiet evidence rather than spectacle. As board members convened for an emergency session, analysts began combing through past foundation records with renewed intensity. In moments of instability, scrutiny expands outward. Journalists revisited older tax filings and dormant audit summaries. During that sweep, a minor but unresolved financial irregularity from several years prior resurfaced in public databases. The detail had once been overlooked as administrative oversight. Now, under heightened attention, it appeared less incidental. What began as a viral video was evolving into a broader examination of institutional conduct. And as headlines updated in real time, a new question began circulating beneath the noise. If one compromise had been documented, how many others had been quietly archived? Long before boardrooms and broadcast studios, Alessandra Vance understood the mathematics of survival in West Hollow. The neighborhood was defined by tight margins and quiet negotiations. As a teenager with academic promise, she had attracted the attention of a local nonprofit mentor who controlled access to private scholarship pipelines. He positioned himself as an advocate for talented students navigating systemic barriers. For Alessandra, he represented opportunity at a scale her family could not manufacture alone. During her final year of high school, a minor funding discrepancy surfaced within that nonprofit's budget. It was not criminal, but it was questionable. Alessandra discovered documentation suggesting that scholarship allocations had been rerouted to cover administrative oversights. When she approached the mentor privately, the response was calm and pragmatic. She was offered accelerated scholarship placement, additional stipend support, and guaranteed recommendation letters in exchange for discretion. The implication was subtle but clear. Exposure would damage everyone, including her own prospects. At 17, Alessandra calculated risk differently than she would later claim. She accepted the offer. She justified the decision as strategic survival within a flawed system. Silence secured her future. Disclosure threatened it. The compromise did not feel like corruption, it felt like adaptation. She convinced herself that once she achieved influence, she would correct the system from within. Instead, the transaction normalized a pattern. Years later, as her career accelerated, Alessandra relied increasingly on structured settlements to neutralize emerging threats. Former employees who raised concerns received generous exit packages accompanied by confidentiality agreements. Minor contractual disputes were resolved quietly through compensation rather than public arbitration. Each decision appeared legally sound. Each reinforced the same blueprint: control risk through resources. Over time, the pattern became indistinguishable from policy. Rowan Mercer's renewed investigation during the video fallout uncovered archived legal filings referencing multiple non-disclosure agreements tied to Vance Foundation initiatives. None were overtly scandalous in isolation. Collectively, however, they suggested a consistent reliance on financial resolution over transparent reform. The documentation reframed Alessandra's recent offer to Malachi and Jalen not as anomaly, but as extension. The bitter irony was unavoidable. The strategy she now deployed mirrored the very power structure she once resented in West Hollow. As a teenager, she had accepted silence in exchange for elevation. As a billionaire, she offered elevation in exchange for silence. The symmetry was not malicious, it was habitual. Yet habit, when reinforced by authority, becomes architecture. Public discourse had not yet connected these historical fragments. The resurfaced irregularity remained under journalistic review. Alessandra, isolated within corporate deliberations, began recognizing the through line herself. The empire she built on discipline and precision rested partially on a compromise she never publicly acknowledged. Meanwhile, Malachi Reed continued observing developments without spectacle. During a private strategy session with Jalen, he referenced archived community stories from West Hollow that predated Alessandra's ascent. His tone was measured, not accusatory. He had studied her trajectory more closely than she realized. What he knew about her past, and why he chose not to reveal it earlier, would soon alter the narrative once again. The public expected retaliation. Instead, Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross released a 12-page reform proposal. The document was structured, data-driven, and absent of emotional language. It outlined a framework for independent oversight of scholarship algorithms, mandatory transparency reports for nonprofit foundations exceeding certain revenue thresholds, and elimination of narrative control clauses in youth development contracts. Rather than framing themselves as victims of attempted payoff, they framed the situation as evidence of systemic imbalance that required correction. Their announcement was delivered through their platform's official channel without dramatic staging. They declined all previously offered financial packages from Vance Enterprises and stated that any collaboration moving forward would require third-party governance and public accountability. The refusal was not loud, but it was firm. By rejecting the compensation publicly, they neutralized speculation about hidden agreements and re-centered the conversation on reform rather than conflict. Public reaction shifted gradually at first, then decisively. Commentators who had initially treated the story as corporate scandal began recognizing the discipline embedded in the boys' strategy. Advocacy organizations praised the proposal's specificity. Educators referenced it in discussions about algorithmic bias and philanthropic oversight. What had started as viral outrage matured into institutional dialogue. The power dynamic no longer favored wealth alone, it favored credibility. Inside Vance Enterprises, the board convened under heightened scrutiny. Investor pressure intensified. The resurfaced financial irregularity remained under review, compounding reputational instability. Several directors questioned whether Alessandra's continued leadership risked long-term erosion of stakeholder confidence. The proposed reforms from Malachi and Jalen circulated within executive inboxes as an unexpected benchmark. For the first time, reform language was coming from outside the boardroom with greater clarity than from within it. What distinguished the moment was restraint. The boys did not seek to dismantle Alessandra personally. They did not expose her teenage compromise publicly, despite possessing knowledge that could have intensified backlash. Their decision to protect certain details reframed their integrity. They were not interested in destruction. They were interested in correction. That distinction resonated across demographic lines, particularly among leaders who understood the fragility of reputation. Alessandra observed the shift with growing awareness that authority without trust becomes unstable. The empire she had defended through controlled settlements now faced evaluation through moral credibility. For the first time, her position was contingent not on performance metrics alone, but on perceived alignment with the reform she once promised. As public admiration for the boys solidified, the board scheduled a formal vote regarding Alessandra's continuation as CEO pending investigation outcomes. Hours before the decision was to be announced, directors delayed proceedings, citing the need to review a forthcoming personal statement from Alessandra herself. The outcome of that statement would determine whether she retained influence or relinquished control entirely. The auditorium at Vance Enterprises headquarters was filled with executives, employees, and media observers when Dr. Alessandra Vance stepped onto the stage for what many suspected would be her final corporate address. The setting was familiar, yet the atmosphere felt fundamentally altered. There were no celebratory banners, no sponsor logos glowing behind her. The lighting was neutral, almost subdued. For the first time in years, the stage did not amplify dominance, it exposed vulnerability. Alessandra's posture remained composed, but the rigid precision that once defined her presence had softened. She did not attempt to dismantle the allegations with technical language. She did not redirect blame toward misunderstanding or misinterpretation. Instead, she acknowledged that her approach to conflict had relied too heavily on control. She described the private compensation offer as a strategic decision shaped by urgency rather than reflection. The phrasing was measured, yet its implication was unmistakable. Power had been used to contain rather than to listen. She announced that she would step down as CEO effective immediately, pending completion of the independent audit into the foundation's practices. The decision, she stated, was not an admission of criminal wrongdoing but recognition that leadership required trust beyond legal compliance. She outlined proposed structural reforms including permanent elimination of narrative control clauses, independent algorithm oversight committees, and annual public transparency reports. The reforms mirrored many of the proposals Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross had advanced, a quiet acknowledgement of influence without naming it. More striking than the reforms was her admission of motive. Alessandra conceded that fear had shaped her reactions. Fear of losing credibility. Fear of appearing weak in environments where weakness once cost her opportunity. The discipline that propelled her ascent had hardened into defensiveness. She did not dramatize the confession. She delivered it plainly without rhetorical flourish. The armor that once shielded her had been set aside. Observers noted the shift immediately. Commentators who had prepared for confrontation instead analyzed introspection. Employees in the audience remained silent, processing a version of their leader rarely displayed publicly. For the first time, Alessandra appeared less like an architect of power and more like someone reckoning with its cost. The board accepted her resignation pending audit results, issuing a brief statement affirming commitment to reform. Market reaction stabilized slightly, reflecting cautious approval of decisive leadership transition. Public response divided between skepticism and recognition of accountability. Yet beneath the debate, a quieter sentiment emerged. The moment felt human. As news cycles recalibrated around her resignation, a new development surfaced with unexpected speed. Federal regulatory agencies confirmed preliminary review of the foundation's tax classifications and historical settlement disclosures. What had begun as reputational crisis now carried potential legal implications beyond corporate governance. Alessandra had relinquished control voluntarily, but control was no longer hers to relinquish. The federal review extended for months, unfolding with procedural patience rather than spectacle. Auditors examined tax classifications, settlement disclosures, and scholarship allocation structures. When the findings were finally released, they concluded that while governance practices required substantial restructuring, no criminal charges were warranted. The outcome carried consequence without catastrophe. The Vance Foundation was mandated to implement independent compliance oversight, revise algorithmic scoring systems, and disclose historical non-disclosure agreements under updated transparency standards. Alessandra Vance resigned permanently from all executive roles within both the corporation and the foundation. The decision marked the end of her formal authority, but not the erasure of her influence. Public reaction was restrained. There were no dramatic victories, only recalibration. Analysts described the outcome as institutional correction rather than corporate collapse. In the months that followed, an anonymous technology incubator fund quietly emerged in West Hollow. The initiative provided open-access coding labs, mentorship programs managed by local educators, and seed capital for student-led innovation projects. The funding source remained undisclosed in official filings, but those familiar with philanthropic patterns recognized the architecture. It was structured without branding, without public acknowledgement, and without narrative ownership clauses. For the first time, impact existed without visibility. Meanwhile, Malachi Reed and Jalen Cross expanded their transparency platform beyond Atlanta. Universities, nonprofit coalitions, and civic policy groups integrated their algorithm review tools into scholarship evaluation systems nationwide. Their framework for independent oversight gained traction in legislative discussions about nonprofit accountability. What began as response to a single offer had matured into a scalable reform model. The transformation within West Hollow felt distinct. Community pride no longer centered on external validation but on internal agency. Residents who once viewed philanthropic events as symbolic gestures now participated directly in oversight committees and policy consultations. The shift was subtle but profound. Assistance was no longer received passively. It was negotiated collectively. From a distance, Alessandra observed the evolution through industry reports and community updates. Without title or spotlight, she confronted a version of legacy detached from control. The wealth she retained remained substantial, but its symbolic power had shifted. Instant karma had not dismantled her fortune. It had dismantled her assumption that influence could be permanently managed through precision. The narrative that once defined her as untouchable now defined her as transitional, a figure whose misstep accelerated reform she might never have initiated voluntarily. The irony was neither cruel nor triumphant. It was instructive. Months later, as policy conferences referenced the boys' platform as a national case study, an unexpected proposal circulated privately between leadership teams. The newly restructured Vance Foundation, now under independent governance, expressed interest in formally integrating the transparency platform into its permanent scholarship evaluation process. The proposal carried no compensation clause, no narrative restrictions, no conditions beyond collaborative reform. Whether Malachi and Jalen would accept remained undisclosed. The future no longer hinged on control, but on choice. If this story made you pause and rethink what power really means, support conversations that challenge influence instead of protecting it. Share this with someone who believes accountability should never be optional, no matter how successful someone becomes. Stay connected for stories that don't just expose systems, they examine the choices inside them. And now ask yourself this: when success is built on survival, at what point does protecting your legacy become the very thing that threatens it?